My name is Eddie Aparicio. We're in my studio in downtown LA. I think I tried not to be an artist. I wouldn't say I tried not to be an artist, but I actually came into it. My father is an artist, and so I grew up in his studio. My whole life I basically would, after school, would go and I'd do my homework and hang out, and the dogs would be running around in his studio in our backyard, so that was something that was always a big part of my life. I think I was painting and making sculpture since I was a little kid. Recently I found a lot of these pieces that are really meaningful to me that I made at that time. So I think I was always making things, and I was always kind of taught by my dad to figure out how to make something on your own. And then I started doing math, and I was doing all these other things, and I was thinking I would do architecture, but then I really just fell in love with art because I have so many interests in so many different realms and sciences and humanities, and I realized that art can just be any of those things. It can be I can spend 2 years researching this material and all of the kind of technical, scientific components that I need to figure out to make that work. And then I can, spend years reading historical kind of texts and working that into the work. And so the thing that made me realize that I wanted to become an artist was that I realized I could do anything that I wanted to do. I could do law. There's just this whole kind of open field that I felt so inspired by. And the main thing is that also the people and the professors and people that were most influential and loving and open-minded with me were my art faculty. And they were so supportive at a time when I wasn't even necessarily thinking about myself in that way. They kind of already saw me as an artist, and they treated me like that, and they gave me so much help and still do to this day. So for me, I think that all the self-confidence that I needed to kind of push into being an artist full time was, I think the origins of that was the people that really influenced me, both my family but also these faculty members that just gave me so much care and love and kind of pushed me, and also all the bad things too. And so they pushed me to kind of to go for it. I think everybody has a materialist practice, but some people I think are more kind of focused on that as the content or as the kind of generative ideas that come out of that. I think for me, I've been frustrated with other types of media that I've tried, and so I've been like painting, the canvas, the cotton, the wood, all the pigments for me were so on my mind every time I was painting. But I would gesso and prepare a canvas, and that would be considered as this kind of neutral space materially, not art historically, but materially. And so for me, I was like, oh no, but there's so much happening here already. All of this comes from somewhere. All of this material has traveled and mirrors so much of the history of colonialism and the history of trade and the history of all of these things that for me I've been really focused on how those things, before you even get the material, before they even come to you, are loaded, and thinking about those kind of precedents to materials also. So for me, it's thinking about the kind of also material as a collaboration. That's something that I've been thinking a lot about. Thinking about how this material, I think as a process, especially as a young artist, there's something that happens when you have this idea and you're trying to figure out what material works best to execute that idea, and more likely than not, you get somewhere close to what you're thinking, but also the material deviates, something goes wrong, and you have this experience where you're kind of finding a middle point between what you wanted to do and what the material wanted to do or was capable of doing. And so the works that we make, I think all the time, are this kind of middle point between this collaborative experience between material, between spaces that we're in. And so if I were to try to describe what a materialist practice is, then I would say something along the lines of kind of embracing that spirit of collaboration with the material, with the kind of origins of that material, and with the spaces that you're kind of currently working in. I think time is interesting because it's like we're also changing with the works, you know, and so it's not just the works are changing, like we are changing, the way that we see the world is constantly changing, our kind of perception of light changes, you know, I think as our bodies get older, I mean, and so that's something that I think about all the time. I think about what it means to be an artist, what it means to collect art, to live with art, to see art in museums, to be a museum that takes care of art. That's something that is always changing. And so I think there's this kind of like idea that, you know, oil paintings, if you make them exactly in the right way and you layer them in the right way, that they will last forever, when that's like, you know, never going to happen. Everything is kind of impermanent. And I think the things that change in our kind of time scale are things that, you know, allow us to see that process happen and understand our own mortality in a specific way, and kind of do away with all of the fallacy of like conservation. I love like living with plants. I normally have lots of plants around me because they have this like relationship to growth and change and time that's kind of really noticeable. So that's something that I think has started to like affect the way that I think about artwork and conservation, and those kinds of issues. Is that like, you know, that's my ideal relationship to an art piece, is the relationship that you have, like a healthy relationship with plant, not the one that dies in the corner, but the one that you really care about, and you're emotionally invested in this plant, and you know, you care about it, and you nurture it, and you do everything you can, and you have this kind of like experience with it. But I would say time is immaterial in as much as it's changing, you know, it's changing the way the material works, it's changing you, and so it's almost like a third person in the room, I would say, in regards to like the artist making the work. It's an interesting question to think about how other people are kind of like creating meaning in the work that, you know, say that I make in the studio, because part of the reason I started making the work that I'm making now is that I've been trying to find ways to kind of like include other, not just people, but other kind of like species and other kind of environmental marks, and have that be part of the like the image making process. And so that's something that I've really kind of been excited about in terms of working with rubber in a specific way. It's documenting not just you know, the graffiti marks on these trees and the carving, but also the trees' growth and, you know, growing back into those carvings, and the marks that car exhaust makes, and the marks, all these things. And so, you know, I think in the work that I'm making, there's so many other people's and, you know, species and there's so many marks that are made that aren't kind of generative for me. I started kind of painting onto the backs of these works. Originally, it was kind of just a way to get out of my fixation in painting. I had a professor in undergrad. When I was making paintings for my senior thesis, I was telling him, I want to drop the whole thing, I want to make a sculpture, and his idea was, I think this is what I do. I go outside, and when I feel like I want to make sculpture, I just chop a bunch of wood, and then I get that sensation out of me, and then I can go back and make my paintings. And so I think that there's kind of this relationship to painting for me that's kind of like complex, and that I started painting on the backs of the works, and that for me was kind of a way to get out my kind of the mark making and the images that I wanted to make, and eventually those kind of became part of the work also, kind of embracing my agency in the making of these things. I kind of always think that for my work specifically, the meaning that everything that I'm kind of creating, only all the things that are in my head are only about 50% of like what I'm imagining, like the kind of intent and meaning is the work. And I, like in my mind, I want to leave like at least 50% of the meaning kind of opened, because so many of the things that I now like talk about and think about in my work are things that other people came to the work, you know, with, and things that they shared with me. And I want to stay open as much as possible to the ways that other people are experiencing this work, and allow that to be a part of the work, and allow that to be a part of the story of the work that I can, you know, tell and share. And so the reasons why I make this work, where the material comes from, where I make them, kind of everything that's involved, I think of as like, you know, only like a portion of what the meaning is in the work. And I really I'm excited about showing the work in different places because people have different relationships to these objects, to the smells that they create, to the ways that they hang, to the images that are painted on them. And I find that to be like kind of equally a part of the work as to like the things that I'm thinking about. In terms of when I talk about environmental justice, it's interesting because it's something that I came to, after starting this work at least. And so a lot of people I think are surprised by that because they see the work and they're kind of, before they, they talk to me or they read about it or they, kind of investigate it further. On the surface, it looks like kind of it's the surface of trees. It looks like it's kind of like documenting these natural forms. And so it must be about something about the natural world. And for me, like when I first started making this work, it couldn't have been more different. I started making this work because I was kind of so consumed in grad school and afterwards with this idea that my identity as a Central American, wanting to make work about the history, these complex histories, things that I felt like I wanted to talk about. I wanted them to be a part of the work, and for me that was a way that I could kind of bring that information out also in the making of the work and talking about it. And so these were almost all stand-ins for me. I was kind of capturing these trees because these trees were in the easement, in these Salvadorian communities, in these kind of Latinx communities in LA. And I saw them almost as like stand-ins for those communities. And so it's a way in which I could think about the gestures of art making, the ways in which, a cut or a drape or, a sew or everything that you do has kind of, for me, that has kind of like a metaphorical connection to thinking about bodies and thinking about the ways in which those gestures are then kind of, in the ways that we utilize gestures in our normal life. And so the way that something hangs, it has this kind of gestural feel that I think communicates something about the way that we exist in the world as well. And so the ways that I was working with these were some of the ways that I could talk about, these like communities. And it wasn't until later on, well, actually I started making this work thinking about the history of, reading kind of the history of these specific species and also reading about, contemporary immigration and all of these other kind of theories and contemporary things that were happening. And I started realizing that there's kind of so much in common. The history of the ficus tree, it was brought into LA in the 50s and 60s. They planted tens of thousands of them all over the city because they grow really fast. They really, they're really strong trees. They have tall, wide canopies, so they provided green, shade and greenery in the city, and cars could pass underneath them. But the reason why they could do that so quickly is that they have buttressing roots. So the roots actually come out of the ground and kind of, support the trunks, kind of like a Gothic cathedral has these pillars that support the walls that would otherwise be too heavy to be, structurally sound. And so those roots came out of the ground. They planted them in these little tiny, cutouts in the concrete. And now LA is known more for its broken sidewalks than for the trees, I feel like. And so now they're being cut down, they're being removed. In the wealthy neighborhoods, they're being actually covered in rubber, strangely enough, to make it to comply with ADA standards. And so for me, that was something that was mirroring so closely what was happening at similar time, 50s and 60s. The braceros were brought in from Mexico. A lot of Central American Mexican people were being brought in legally to the United States and essentially rebuilt the United States economy after World War II through this huge agricultural labor force. And this all started because during the 2016 Republican primary, I was hearing Trump talk about this thing called Operation Wetback, and he was talking, he kept mentioning Operation Wetback, and I was like, what the heck is that? I didn't even really know what that history was. It sounded so racist that I needed to know what it was, and it was basically, he was referring to this operation, I think it was Eisenhower, in the 60s. He basically deemed that all of these braceros, people that were here legally working, needed to be deported immediately back to Mexico, and so there was, thousands of human rights violations that were reported during the time. Millions and millions of Central American Mexicans were being deported back. And so for me, it was this situation that so closely mirrored the relationship to these trees. The history of these trees being utilized but not given the appropriate resources and space to thrive in these spaces, and then being cut down and removed. And so the kind of history of these trees and the histories of these communities were so linked being grown in the same spaces. And so I really then started to think about the history and the kind of like the history of environmental justice and how closely that is linked to the history of social justice. And in Central America, pretty much all over the world, the history of colonialism is so closely linked to the history of agricultural exploitation and the exploitation of people and in these lands. And so that's something that for me has kind of become a really important part of my conceptualization of the politics of this work specifically. And I think the politics, in the way that I say everyone's practice is a materialist practice, I think everyone's practice is involved in these kind of forces. It's just a lot of people, I think about themselves as neutral or somehow like existing in other conversations. And I think I've just been, now that's just how I see everything. It's how I see everybody's work. I'm thinking about kind of these forces at play and the ways in which, our kind of mutual survival is dependent on each other, both humans and trees and other kind of natural species, the world in general. And kind of taking true to the word ecology of like all of these things kind of being relational to each other and being kind of, dependent on each other. And so in terms of environmental history, I would say that that's, there's almost no separation in my mind anymore to environmental justice and social justice, because especially in terms of a conversation around Latin America, that's something that has always been kind of inextricably linked. Creating art, I think, has been enriching in my life because it's exposed me to, I think, myself. I think there's a lot that I've discovered about myself that in making the art, and I don't necessarily see a separation between myself and the work. I don't take things personally when people say things about my work, but with considering my last sentence, I probably should. I find it to be something that helps me understand like where I come from, where my parents come from. A lot of the things I've learned have come out of making work, or at least the research that went into the making of the work. And I think the work is me also kind of trying to process and understand these things that I'm currently in process of learning and understanding. And I think that that's something that I really love about art, and it's changed my life, is to be able to have a mode of like expression that can be concurrent with my changing identity and my changing sense of self and the things that I learn about the world or about my family history or about kind of world history or kind of contemporary society, and have the skill to be able to try to like make that into something that exists outside of myself. And then have other people reflect on it. And so, the work exists on itself, but to me, there's like things, really specific things in it that I didn't understand, like I was stitching the edges of the works to keep them kind of connected to the backing, and I was using just this stitch that made sense to me. And then I did a show in 2018 where I put all of those dolls, my grandma's dolls, in the show, and I was walking out of the show and I realized as I was looking at the dolls that the stitch that I was using was the stitch that she used on every edge of every one of her dolls. I never knew her. She was, she died when I was about 4 years old and lived in El Salvador, but I had hundreds or thousands of these dolls growing up that my dad would bring from El Salvador, and so I kind of saw them as my way of also getting to know her and getting to know my, a part of myself through that. And so for me, it was almost like this inherited ways of unconscious things that we do that reference like our own life experiences and the life experience of people that, have had an influence on us, even if we have never met them. This kind of like, I think about it like the way that oral history was passed along is passed along in so many generation. I think that material history is passed along in a similar way, like the way that we see our parents or grandparents cooking, the way that they fold clothes, the way that they, hold themselves. The way that I'm standing right now is the way that I saw my dad and pictures of my grandma standing. It's this kind of like way that we observe and become subconscious to the way that we exist in ourselves. And I think that as artists, or for me specifically as an artist, a lot of the things that I'm looking for in the work are kind of, I try to work as intuitively as I can, because I'm so excited when I can think or find some connection to something that was already inside of me that I learned through, about that. And so I would say art is enriching in my life because it enriches my own understanding of myself and enriches It helps me process the things that I see in the world, the things that I see that I don't even know that I see. I think that there's a specific way that art captures your kind of inner self in a way, if you let it, that isn't necessarily like the most contrived or the most, like the first thought on your mind. And so sometimes I sit and I look and I think about my work and the decisions that I decided to make, which at the time seemed random, but the more that I think about them, the more that I learn about myself, or even just the imagination of those things being true, is something that I find to be one of the most rewarding experiences of my life.